There are wounds we carry that never show on the skin. They don't bleed, but they ache. They don't scream, but they echo quietly, endlessly. Tonight, we speak not as victims, not as accusers, but as witnesses to the unseen damage caused by words. Words that were spoken by those who claimed to love us the most. Why can't you be more like your brother? You're too sensitive. You'll never make it if you keep acting like that. To outsiders, these are just phrases. But to a child, they become laws etched into the psyche. Rules about who they're allowed to be, what they're allowed to feel, and how worthy they are of love. This episode is not about hating parents. It's about understanding patterns, ones passed down through fear, control, and generational pain. It's about the psychology of manipulation, the philosophy of broken love, and the quiet war that takes place inside homes filled with unhealed adults raising innocent children. We enter this conversation with compassion, but not naivety. We know some parents did their best. We also know that best can still cause harm, and the truth must be named before it can be healed. So let us begin with open minds and steady hearts. This is not just their story. It might be yours too. Let's begin. They called it love, but it didn't feel like love. It felt like walking barefoot through a house full of glass, learning to smile while bleeding. From the outside, everything looked normal. The family photos, the birthday parties, the I love you said at dinner. But inside that house, love came wrapped in sharp edges. And the child, you learned early that love was something that hurt. You're so dramatic. I sacrificed everything for you. No one else will ever love you like I do. These phrases sound familiar. They echo in the heads of grown adults trying to make sense of why they feel broken, why they struggle to set boundaries, why they confuse guilt with affection. The truth? This isn't love. It's control disguised as concern. It's emotional manipulation served on a plate called parenting. Dark psychology calls it gaslighting in nurturing form. The parent uses shame and obligation to program obedience. And the child, needing survival more than truth, complies. They learn to abandon themselves in exchange for approval. They become experts in silence, in smiling through pain, in pretending that what's killing them is somehow their fault. Because when love comes attached to conditions, you're only lovable when you succeed, when you behave, when you mirror me. The child internalizes one core belief. I am not enough as I am. The philosopher might say, some knives don't cut the skin, they slice the soul, and they're passed down like heirlooms. And so the cycle begins. That child grows up. They crave validation from people who treat them the same way. They repeat the wound. Not because they're weak, but because it's what feels familiar. The damage is subtle, but deadly. You begins to believe love always comes with pain. And worse, they begin to seek it out. This is not an attack on parents. This is a reckoning. An attempt to name what was never named. To give voice to the child who was told to stay quiet. To say, that wasn't love. That was control. That was fear. That was a knife. And it was wrapped in a ribbon you were too young to question. Let this be the beginning, not of blame, but of clarity. You grew up, but the voice never left. It wasn't loud anymore, it didn't need to be. It had been internalized. Now it whispered beneath their choices, inside relationships, behind every apology they never owed. It said, you're too much. You're a burden. Don't make people uncomfortable. This echo shaped everything. The way they loved, the way they failed to say no, the way they gave too much, asked for too little, and felt guilty for simply existing. It wasn't what was said once, it was what was said often. With repetition, it became truth. With truth, it became identity. Dark psychology understands this as identity erosion, the process by which a child absorbs criticism as fact, until they no longer remember who they were before they were told who they should be. You're selfish. You're lazy. You're ungrateful. These weren't observations. They were definitions. And you carried them like scars under a smile. Even praise became a trap. When a parent says, I'm proud of you because you got good grades. What the child hears is, my worth is conditional. I must earn love. So they become high achievers, perfectionists, people pleasers. Not out of ambition, but out of fear. Fear of being unloved. Fear of being abandoned. Fear of being seen and rejected. Raw philosophy asks, what happens to a person who was never loved as they were, only as they performed? They disappear. Not all at once, but slowly. They become a version of themselves tailored to avoid punishment, to gain approval. A ghost of who they could have been. They don't ask for much. They over-explain. They stay in jobs, relationships, and roles that drain them because somewhere deep down, they still believe they're the problem. And this is the cruelest part of all. The wound becomes the compass. They navigate life not by dreams or joy, but by avoidance. Avoiding rejection. Avoiding failure. Avoiding themselves. The echo is no longer just in the parent's voice. It lives inside your own. Until they stop. Until they question. Until they realize, maybe that voice was never mine. This is not about blame. It's about origin. To heal a wound, you must find where it began. To reclaim your voice, you must silence the echo. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do is to listen to yourself for the very first time. You leave home, but not the patterns. They meet new people, form new relationships, walk into new spaces. But somehow, the same pain follows. Different faces, same script. They fall for people who invalidate them. Bosses who manipulate. Friends who disappear when they speak their truth. Lovers who punish them with silence. To the outsider, it looks like bad luck. But to you, it's déjà vu. Dark psychology calls this trauma reenactment. It's not random. It's reflex. The psyche gravitates toward what is familiar, even if it hurts. Because the subconscious doesn't crave love. It craves recognition. And so, you is drawn to mirrors. People who reflect the very dynamics they once survived. A mother's cold distance. A father's anger wrapped in control. A caregiver's affection laced with conditions. These relationships feel magnetic. Inevitable. But they aren't love, they're repetition. A desperate attempt to relive the past, hoping this time, the ending will change. They think, if I can make this person stay, if I can be perfect enough, calm enough, quiet enough, maybe I'll finally feel worthy. But wounds don't heal through reenactment. They deepen. And here lies the harsh truth. We don't choose our pain, but we do choose to repeat it. Until we don't, you begins to notice that they flinch at kindness. That peace feels unfamiliar. That healthy people bore them because they don't cause adrenaline spikes. Raw philosophy offers this reflection. When your nervous system is trained in chaos, calm feels like danger. When pain is the blueprint, peace feels fake. So you sabotages it. They pick fights. Withdraw. Cling to toxicity, not because they want to suffer, but because they've mistaken survival patterns for love. They think, it's not love if it doesn't hurt. But that's the old mirror speaking. And here's the shift. When you finally recognize the pattern, you gain power over it. You doesn't need to fix the past by reenacting it. They need to grieve it. Mourn the childhood they didn't get. Release the fantasy that this time, it will be different if they just try harder. This is the quiet beginning of change. Not loud, not dramatic, just awareness. And with that awareness comes the hardest realization of all. You were never unlovable. You were just taught to love in a battlefield. You sits alone. No screams. No chaos. Just silence. But even in silence, they hear echoes. Old words, sharp as blades, still living rent-free in their mind. You're too sensitive. You'll never be enough. Stop crying or I'll give you something to cry about. These aren't just memories. They're programming. Toxicity, when repeated long enough, becomes inheritance. Not written in wills, but etched into nervous systems. Passed down like family recipes, except instead of nourishment, they carry shame, fear, and emotional paralysis. You doesn't just inherit eye color or posture. They inherit beliefs. That love must be earned. That emotions are dangerous. That speaking up leads to punishment. And worst of all, that their needs are a burden. This is the invisible inheritance. Pain disguised as discipline. Control disguised as protection. Silence disguised as strength. Dark psychology knows this well. Children don't question authority, they internalize it. They don't think, my parent is wrong. They think, something is wrong with me. That belief becomes identity. That identity becomes attraction. And that attraction becomes a life filled with echoes of the same pain, repeated across lovers, friends, even their own children. You isn't broken. They're conditioned. Conditioned to confuse fear with respect. To tolerate disrespect in the name of keeping the peace. To over-explain, over-give, and under-receive. Because deep down, they believe love is something to earn, never something to rest in. Raw philosophy asks, what if your entire definition of love is based on how you were hurt? What if your compass points toward the very thing you need to walk away from? You begins to see it. The patterns weren't accidents. They were echoes. Echoes of a system that taught them their value came from obedience, from endurance, from being invisible enough not to cause trouble. But the truth is this. The pain didn't start with them. But the healing must. You doesn't need more advice. They need to reparent themselves. To become the voice they never had. To say, you are allowed to rest. You are not too much. You are loved, even when you say no. This is how the inheritance ends. Not in confrontation, but in quiet reclamation. Because healing isn't always about fixing. Sometimes it's about unlearning what never belonged to you. You stands at a quiet crossroads. Not a loud rebellion. No screaming. No slamming of doors. Just a pause, a breath, a decision. For years, their life was a performance. A constant audition for love. Smiling when it hurt. Saying it's okay when it wasn't. Being the good child, the strong one, the peacekeeper. But inside, a volcano. The kind of rage that isn't loud. It simmers. Not because they're angry people, but because they've swallowed too many things that should have been screamed out loud. And now comes the moment of revolt. Not against their parents, but against the version of themselves that was created by survival. You doesn't want revenge. They want freedom. And to get there, they must face a terrifying truth. Love without safety is not love. Discipline without empathy is control. And silence, no matter how well behaved, is not healing. They begin to ask dangerous questions. What if my parents were wrong? What if I didn't deserve that pain? What if loyalty to dysfunction is not love, but fear? This is not rebellion for rebellion's sake. It's reclamation. UT starts small. They stop apologizing for things they didn't do. They say no and let it hang in the air without guilt. They stop chasing the approval that was never freely given. And slowly, the volcano begins to cool. Not because the fire is gone, but because it finally has a voice. This is what dark psychology rarely tells you. The greatest revolt is not in rejecting others. It's in refusing to abandon yourself, ever again. Raw philosophy adds, some chains are invisible because they were made of love. But a cage, no matter how gold-plated, is still a cage. You realize is something haunting. The most toxic words weren't shouted. They were whispered, wrapped in concern, disguised as guidance. But now, the spell breaks. They no longer see themselves through the cracked mirror of their childhood. They start building a new reflection, one not shaped by fear, but by choice. This is the moment of revolt. It doesn't come with fireworks. It comes with a whisper. I choose me. And for the first time, that voice isn't shaky. It's steady. It's clear. It's home. After the revolt, there is no applause. No parade for the child who finally stood up from the wreckage of old words. Just silence. And for a while, it feels like loneliness. Because healing, despite what the world tells you, isn't loud or cinematic. It's quiet, private, uncomfortable. You begins again not with grand declarations, but small decisions. They no longer laugh at jokes that cut too deep. They no longer explain their boundaries with a trembling voice. They no longer shrink when someone raises theirs. There is power in their stillness now. Not coldness, not bitterness, but clarity. In this silence, they start noticing things they once missed. How certain compliments were actually control. How every "I'm just joking" left invisible bruises. How the praise was always conditional on obedience, not authenticity. They sit with these realizations. Let them sting. Let them breathe. And most importantly, let them go. Because here's the truth. Healing is not just cutting ties. It's cutting illusions. The illusion that your worth was ever tied to someone else's comfort. The illusion that you had to earn the right to be treated well. The illusion that being quiet meant being strong. Now, in this silence, a new self begins to speak. Not the version that was molded by fear, but the version buried underneath all the noise. This voice says, you're allowed to walk away without guilt. You don't owe love to those who used it as a leash. You can be loyal to your peace, not your past. You start reading books they once feared, journaling the truth they were never allowed to speak, listening to their inner child without judgment, without rushing them to get over it. Because rebuilding isn't about forgetting. It's about remembering differently. Remembering the events without the shame. Remembering the pain without the blame. Remembering yourself as someone who survived, not someone who failed. Dark psychology says, the mind returns to pain because it seeks completion. But raw philosophy whispers, completion doesn't come from fixing others. It comes from finally seeing yourself as whole, even with the scars. And in that wholeness, something begins to grow. Not just confidence, not just strength, but softness. A softness that no longer fears being misunderstood. A softness that protects, not pleases. A softness that says, I can love without abandoning myself ever again. You no longer build walls. They build thresholds. And only those who knock with gentleness are allowed in. The final betrayal was never from others. It was from the voice that echoed in your head long after the room went silent. You, now sitting in the solitude they once feared, begins to hear it more clearly. That voice, not theirs, but one they carried like a second skin. It says, you're too sensitive. You always overreact. No one will love you if you keep being like this. It's not just memory. It's programming. Installed not by malice, but by generations of unhealed pain. Because most parents didn't mean to wound. They simply passed on what was done to them. And still, the wound is real. You begins to realize they cannot go back and rewrite the story, but they can stop reading it on loop. So, they do something radical. They become the parent they never had. They speak to their inner child with kindness. Not false positivity, but with fierce protection. When the voice says, you're not enough, they respond, you were never meant to be someone else's idea of enough. When the voice says, you're difficult to love, they whisper, love isn't earned. It's recognized. They stop punishing themselves for how they coped. People-pleasing, perfectionism, self-silencing. These weren't flaws. They were survival tools. But survival is not the same as living. So you retires those tools. They begin choosing discomfort that leads to freedom, instead of comfort that leads to chains. They set boundaries not to push people away, but to let themselves in. They no longer need a parent to validate their worth. They are the validator now, the nurturer, the protector. And when the past tries to knock again, in the form of toxic people, old triggers, familiar shame, they don't fight it with anger. They meet it with presence. A soft, unwavering presence that says, I've got you. I'm not leaving this time. Because the healing was never about fixing the parent. It was about becoming one. For the parts of you that were left behind, you doesn't become perfect. They become whole. And in that wholeness, there is room. For grief. For joy. For peace. And most importantly, for a new story. A story where the cycle ends. Not with revenge, not with silence, but with love, redefined.